commercial sex, that means sex in exchange for a benefit, you can charge that and prosecute that as human trafficking. That is a human trafficking case. So what we're seeing is under 18 is a very vulnerable. We see a ton of particularly juvenile runaways and juveniles with unstable home or family lives that become engaged in what we would call survival sex or sex in exchange for a benefit that they are needing for stabilization, and those are human trafficking cases. So that is an interesting feature as well. We will talk much more about the kind of legal framework here later, but for some background, there's our federal framework, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and other related federal trafficking statutes. We also very often will see the Mann Act as an accompanying federal statute to trafficking cases, which is a really good tool that federal prosecutors in particular have that state prosecutors don't. But we do very often see those cases kind of accompany human trafficking cases in federal space. State law, of course, we have our TCA 39-13-309, if I'm remembering correctly from my prosecutor days. And that is also, I believe, currently sitting with a B felony for adults and I think an A felony for juveniles these days, or at least juveniles under 15, if I'm not mistaken. One of the things that is important when you're practicing in this space is that often trafficking cases are multi-jurisdictional. That's often why these cases will go federal, but of course, it is entirely possible to prosecute a state case in tandem, but it's also entirely possible to prosecute a trafficking case across multiple jurisdictions. So coordination is really important and makes for a successful prosecution of these cases. All right, some signs and indicators here. Now, I say that all trafficking, no single fact establishes trafficking. These are patterns. These are patterns that warrant additional screening that is consistent with your scope of representation or your setting, of course. But the way that we like to talk about it is there are a million ways to make a chocolate cake, but in general, the same ingredients exist. These are some ingredients, but it doesn't always mean that, any one or a bunch of these indicators is absolutely trafficking, but these surely are signs that we look out for. It's also really important to note that all trafficking is severely underreported, but particularly labor trafficking. So the importance here of you being proactive in identifying some of these indicators is that when you ask the right questions or you approach screening in a trauma-informed way, you're actually opening yourself up as a safe space for reporting for a survivor, when otherwise these crimes in particular are drastically underreported because of the kind of mechanisms of the crime itself and the survivor population. One of the things that I'll say that is unique, I think, in the attorney space is, and particularly in the criminal law space, is that very often trafficking cases will come to the courtroom looking like a domestic violence case. But if you are conscious of reading a warrant or reading an affidavit with an eye towards these vulnerabilities, you will very often see that what is looking like a domestic violence case may have indicators of trafficking. That's because we're not going to see survivors, like I said, incredibly severely underreported, but also very infrequent that a survivor is self-disclosing. So what a survivor might come in and say is, that's my boyfriend. The reality is that boyfriend is actually their trafficker. We also very, very frequently see familial trafficking, which again would run through that kind of domestic violence track. And when we're looking at familial trafficking, it may look like a familial domestic violence case, but the reality is, and if you're paying close enough attention and looking out for some of these other indicators, there might be trafficking going on as well. The kind of biggest thing that I would say is, the most prevalent indicator of potential trafficking is a combination of sort of external vulnerabilities, food insecurity, experiencing homelessness, or coming from a kind of marginalized community, coupled with signs of not being in control of their personal identity, limited access to their own resources, or potentially just kind of uh, elusive and suspicious behavior when it comes to trying to identify who they are or where they live. But again, I always like to say your gut is the most important feature here. You will know if there is something off, and I have said that time and time again, and I found that to be true. And if you think there is something off, there are ways to address that in a kind of a trauma-informed and confidential way. That is also why we have NGOs or nonprofits that exist in the space to assist you with that kind of thing if you think you are working with somebody who may be being trafficked. Very simply, what traffickers are looking for is unmet needs and vulnerabilities. This is what we see 99.9% of the time with the survivors that we work with. We are looking at somebody with an unmet need or a vulnerability and a trafficker who is really good at preying on that need. Traffickers will specifically look for people who are lacking in their basic needs. Going up from there, those wants, dreams, and desires. This is why we very often see, again, at-risk youth that are trafficked that lack stability and often lack some of their basic needs. And we put Maslow's hierarchy up here because, of course, those are the first needs that somebody needs to have met. And traffickers are really adept at preying on those needs in their in victims. So again, the more needs that we can help fulfill, the better results that we have of getting somebody out of an active trafficking situation and also of preventing recidivism into trafficking. But one of the ways that we talk about this is, and it's not to say necessarily that traffickers are abundantly smart, but in general, seeking those vulnerabilities is what makes them successful. And so the way that we talk about this, I remember a TBI agent once said this in his presentation about this, and I really loved it. What he said was like a trafficker is going to go up to two people and he's going to say to both of them, "I love your shoes." And the person who looks him back straight in the eye and says, "Wow, thanks, these are great shoes," is not the person that trafficker is going to engage with. It's a person who kind of looks down, "Oh, you really like these? They're old and they're this and they're that." And that's a better angle for a trafficker. That's somebody who is experiencing some vulnerability, some self-doubt. That's the person that a trafficker will target more so than somebody who's self-actualized and has all of their needs met. I love the human trafficking in the media game. If I could see anybody, I would ask you to raise your hands about who has seen Taken by Liam Neeson, which is, we know, wonderful film, but in a lot of ways has really damaged the kind of real survivor, I would say, ability to disclose. The media has sensationalized trafficking in a way that has made it so that very often it is not only hard to identify or get disclosures from survivors, but it's really hard to prosecute the cases. Because if you have a jury of your peers that have seen any of these movies, that is what they're expecting you to present in court. And more likely than not, this is not the kind of story that we're seeing of trafficking, particularly domestically here in the States. Like I said, most frequently we are seeing vulnerable people, particularly who are experiencing drug abuse, homelessness, mental health issues, who are being exploited by somebody who is taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. Very infrequently are we seeing somebody with a stable family who was kidnapped out of their backyard and is being trafficked. It's not to say that those things never happen. It's to say that they are much less frequent. And in fact, at Hope for Justice, we've worked with survivors from all types of trafficking situations. And we have worked, in fact, with a survivor of Jeffrey Epstein, which, of course, has really brought trafficking to the forefront here. And what I'll tell you about our work with this Epstein survivor is that her experience really was as sensational, quote unquote, as the media has often made trafficking cases look. But her story is no more or less worthy than the stories that we see every day from people who are trafficked right out of their own backyard. So again, it's not to say that we shouldn't be watching these movies and enjoying them, but it is to say that you need to, if you're working with survivors, you need to be conscious of your own bias, that's created from the way that media portrays trafficking, and also be conscious of biases of others that you may be encountering when you're working with a survivor. And that's really important too when we're talking about these expungement laws that we'll, get into much more later. But the affidavits that will accompany these expungements very often are not going to be sensationalized like this. And that's something that you have to get everybody, including judges, DAs, etc., to understand. I'm going to touch very briefly on trauma-informed client interaction. So a trauma-informed approach really has to do with you acknowledging that trauma affects memory, it affects trust, it affects communication, and it affects decision making. So what that means is if you are working with a trafficking survivor, it is on you to create conditions that increase the survivor's feeling of safety. And that is by being very, very plain in your language, allowing the client to control the pace of their own disclosure. That's incredibly important. And asking permission. Hey, is it okay if we talk about this? This is a sensitive question. Feel free to hold it until you're comfortable answering. The more that you create that safety, the better outcomes that you'll have in getting disclosures that are favorable, both for the expungement purposes and for any other purpose. Another thing to really acknowledge is that inconsistencies or delayed disclosures in trafficking are not indicators of dishonesty. Those are indicators of trauma. So when you're working with trafficking survivors, you really have to balance the legal needs for survivors with the reality that the trauma that they've experienced may mean that they're prioritizing everything other than their legal remedies or their post-conviction remedies. And that's okay. So we have to be very conscious of how we're asking a survivor to participate. For the most part, with these expungements, survivors will be in a more stable position. However, reliving their trafficking situation may cause a resurgence of trauma that may kind of rear its head in ways that seem like ambivalence, but it is not ambivalence. And then, of course, your ethical practice requires you to be paying attention to confidentiality, mandatory reporting, and just exposing your client to any kinds of danger. So that's just something to be very conscious of as well. All right. Now, getting into the crux of it for me is working with partners and services. So trafficking cases very often involve working alongside social workers or advocates. This kind of collaboration we have seen really improve safety, continuity of care, and case outcomes for survivors. So particularly if you are working with a survivor and they are not connected with services, it is always good practice to offer services for that survivor. Again, just to increase resiliency and decrease the chance that a survivor re-enters their trauma and in a way that is detrimental to their safety or well-being. And that is where we at Hope for Justice can come in for you. At Hope for Justice, we've reached more than 150,000 people this year across all of our programs. I'm going to focus particularly on our Tennessee program here. But just to say that we, like I mentioned at the top, we're a global anti-trafficking organization with many years of experience serving survivors, boots on the ground. I run and head up all of our U.S. programs. We have 3 regional centers currently in the U.S., Iowa, North Carolina, and here in Tennessee. I also oversee our policy work. And again, I have a lot of kind of connection with this policy and legislation in specific. And then we also have a team of 5 private investigators across the nation who help survivors connect with law enforcement as sort of a bridge between law enforcement and survivors. This is really important for survivors who are fearful of law enforcement. Our investigators are trauma-informed, and they are all well-trained and well-versed in working with survivors. For our Middle Tennessee program and services, I say Middle Tennessee, but we are actually looking to expand across the state. And we are a great resource for connections across the state and across the country. But in terms of our actual survivor care, we work mostly here in Middle Tennessee. We do outreach, case management, and investigative services, which I've mentioned. We do a ton of street outreach where we actually connect with vulnerable populations by going to areas where we know that there's a high percentage of unhoused people or people in marginalized populations in other ways. Really importantly, we do provide non-time bound and very low barrier case management and long-term support and advocacy for survivors of trafficking. That means if you have clients or people that you're working with who you think have been trafficked, who you think lack support, please call us. We can help provide tandem support for your clients. And again, we really have seen that this has increased resiliency in survivors and really increased favorable outcomes both in the civil and criminal space. So here's how you contact us. I've put up the number of our Tennessee program lead and of our investigations team lead, and then I've put my email on the screen here. I've also put the human trafficking hotline over here because, of course, if you think that you are seeing an active trafficking situation, your first call should be to 911. But if you think that you're working with a client, maybe outside of one of our service areas or who you think might be better suited through the hotline is a great number to call as well. But this is all of our information. I am always happy to take questions. You can call, you can email us. We aim to be low barrier and accessible for survivors across the state and, like I said, across the nation. So please, if there are any questions, Savannah, I think, is monitoring the chat, but that is all from my time. And I will turn it back over to Savannah to introduce Kara, who will really get to the laws, particularly the expungement law. And it has been a true pleasure. So thank you for having me.